Hi, and welcome to today's session at Blockchain Week. This afternoon, we have Lucas Cullen from Bitcoin. He's a Bitcoin consultant from DLTx, and he's going to be speaking about blockchains, past, present, and future. Over to you, Lucas.
Alrighty, thanks for the introduction. So I guess today I'm just going to present a little bit about myself and what I see might happen in the future in this space. And when I do that, I like to, I guess, reflect on the past, and not to say the past can predict the future, but I think it's also important that we look back at history and see some of the trends and try and forecast some of the technologies and that might be important to this space. So this is a talk, just like I said, from my observations or my ramblings about how we got here. So like I said, in other words, how we got here and where we're going and why. I think that's important as we try and answer the questions of what the future might entail. So a little bit about myself, colloquial known as Bitcoin Grandpa. I've been in the space for quite some years. Started out as a professional software developer for many years. I actually started coding very early on the Apple IIs and Commodore 64s and those basic systems. And I got interested in Bitcoin in around 2011 and started developing on it. Back in those times, there was not a lot of tooling, so I found it really interesting to try and develop on top of these protocols and get familiar with them and help grow the ecosystem from a tech point of view. And then Ethereum, I was probably on Ethereum at day one in 2015. So along the way, I started the Brisbane meetup, which we call Bitcoin Brisbane, in 2013, and I'll share some things from those meetups. And I think it's interesting to reflect on how even the community and the ecosystem has really matured. So we started, I became on junior vice president of Bitcoin Association back in, I think, 2014 with Adam Poulton. And, again, that association has grown to what we call now Blockchain Australia, and obviously matured significantly since those early days. Also was a lead developer and a shareholder in one of Australia's, I think maybe Australia's biggest Bitcoin mine, running 100% off renewables, and it's sitting at around 3% of the network hash. So again, when we see these conversations or comments about the consumption of Bitcoin energy, it's not really fair, and we should, bring forward some of these techs or companies trying to use renewables and being very profitable because of that. So yeah, it's interesting to note nonetheless. I consider myself a very early adopter of tech as well. I'm probably one of those people that, bought DVD players very early. They were significantly overpriced. But again, I like to get in early on technology and tinker and play with it, which has led me here today. So recently I've been working on a lot of DeFi and NFT projects as well. So as mentioned, I was thinking about why this talk. A lot of these conferences, they go deep on current trends. I've seen a lot of speakers this week talking about, layer 2 solutions and industry and government. So I thought I'll try and, like I said, reflect on the past and perhaps bring people that are new into this space on some of the decisions and the journey along the way. So perhaps that can shape some of the thinkings. Like I said, then talk about the explosion of protocols and projects today, and then maybe hypothesize on what we might see happening in the future. Why, I guess, when we're doing a lot of blockchain and Ethereum development, there's a lot of questions that get asked. Where should we be allocating our resources to perhaps future-proof the product with all things considered? And those are really hard questions to answer. So again, if we do some of the background, then we could perhaps try and take a good guess at where we think it's going and where to protect your investment and where perhaps we should, look at putting our projects. So I'm old enough to start my professional career as the internet was coming online, and I think it's important to look back at some of the technologies that were coming online then. This is the days when the internet was very immature. Things like browsers, and that was still not ratified or standardized. Internet Explorer 4 came out and didn't really adhere to some of the W3 standards, which had ramifications in the web industry that we're still seeing today. We also saw technology such as Google and PayPal and Facebook come online. And I think that's important to note too, because if we're trying to predict the future, then what we're seeing in respect to perhaps the search engine space, that it's really only one player, and perhaps even in the payments, PayPal has pretty much dominated that space. So I think it might be naive of us to think that history won't repeat itself and some technologies won't converge, and we might have some big players in the future that own a lot of that domain. The other thing of interest too, I remember back in 2004, I think it was, when Second Life came on, and I think this is interesting now because of the metaverse conversation. So we have actually seen efforts to virtualize before, and we actually did see a Linden dollar in there to a virtual currency, and that really resonated with me back then on how can we have artificial currencies and within an ecosystem. So again, I think there's an opportunity that history will repeat itself. And if we look at what Second Life did and the investment going into those projects, I remember IBM, etc., were putting big real estate, spending a lot of money on advertising and putting them into those projects, and perhaps nothing really come of it. So perhaps it's a lesson there. So back in the day, back in the early 2011s, 12s, when I started the meetups, the ecosystem was very different, as you can imagine. And I'll share some of those things with you. The meetups was more focused on payments and perhaps self-sovereignty and libertarian. The idea of number go up and mooning and profits were not really talked about. They weren't considered as really finding people that you could have a conversation with, not being the crazy person in the room and talking about crypto and Bitcoin not being a naughty word. And obviously with Silk Road and some of those other early platforms, it did get that kind of tone. So it was really good to network with people and talk about ideas. And like I said, the focus was really targeted towards payments. And so I went back through some of my history here, and the pain was real, so to speak, that even buying coins, we didn't have the likes of some of the exchanges we have now, FTX and SwiftX and Independent Reserve. And we're actually buying coins off eBay. This was one of the screenshots I remember when Dogecoin started sponsoring the NASCAR, and I bought in here in 2014. So like I said, some would say a bit early. And I remember now, it's quite funny, when I saw the coin jar sponsoring my football team, the Melbourne Demons, I actually reached out to them in 2013, with the idea of accepting payments for merchandise. So perhaps I planted the seed, and 10 years later, CoinJar closed that deal that I started for them. Actually, you don't know where to find me. So around that time, 2013, we started seeing this explosion of altcoins. And I think, again, this is an important thing to note, that at the start, we just had this one currency, Bitcoin, and we're kind of all seeing where it went. And then, being the nature of open source, that we started seeing all these altcoins come off. Now, some may say it distracted the narrative. Some may say it, created innovation. Litecoin in 2011 changed the parameters a bit and changed how mining was done. And it got to a point where, like anyone was just creating coins, and Dogecoin was a good example of that, like just to create a meme coin. And, lo and behold, it's still running today. But generally, they're all very much the same, but just changing the knobs and parameters a lot. So then we started building on top of some of these protocols, maybe thinking about them not more as a application or a coin, but perhaps a programming language or something to, to disrupt other industries. So in around 2013, I think, or 2014, might even prior to 2013, the Open Assets Protocol was formed, which was basically putting arbitrary data in what we call the Bitcoin opcode. And we started seeing other services or industries come up and not be very successful about notarization services, perhaps putting hashes of documents and persisting on chain. But if we look back, that, in my opinion, UTXO-based currencies and script-based languages did not allow for easy programming. So I'll just share a bit of an example on what we mean by that for those who haven't had the displeasure of coding on Bitcoin. So with Bitcoin, you don't actually have a balance, so to speak. You have a number of what we call UTXOs, which we can think of as perhaps change in your wallet. So in this table here, we might have 10 cents, 10 cents, 20 cents, and 5 cents. And then the running total is 45 cents. So when we create a Bitcoin transaction, say we want to actually send 1.95 Bitcoin, the developer must work out how to create that transaction. Now, we might argue that we want to choose the earliest transactions first and create that one transaction. So in this circumstance, we might want to take the 10 cents and the 10 cents. The change either comes back to us or it goes as a minor fee. And, there's a lot of engineering considerations with respect to transaction size because the transactions are predicated on the size of the payload. Another option would be to take the 0.2 and have a smaller payload. As we can see, the change comes back. But the problem we have, going back to the original premise of coding open assets on the UTXO in Bitcoin and UTXO protocols, is that if I have something like an asset, like a gold token that sits within this UTXO of 0.01, and that is mapped within the alt return code, that if the wallet is naive to this, I might actually destroy that transaction and just in a day-to-day transaction. So in retrospect, it was a good idea, but unless all wallets are aware, it can have some massive ramifications. And based on this and the limitations of Bitcoin was actually one of the reasons that, or motivations that Vitalik actually started the Ethereum protocol. So, but it's some good ideas, and it started to form this idea that we're going out of perhaps these things are just coins and tokens and currencies, or do we consider these things as protocols and applications? So then on the scene around early 2015, Ethereum was launched and pre-mined, and it introduced the idea of a global programming computer where developers had languages that we could write programs on to facilitate other things such as tokens or smart contracts. But Ethereum was still very targeted as fuel and not a currency. So, we jumped onto this protocol and we've seen the successes from it. And based on that, like I said, then in the 2016s and 17s, we saw the explosion of tokens and projects become layering on top of Ethereum. So back what we call back in the good old ICO days, where it seemed that every other day we heard another successful ICO raise. And it's really because of the ERC20 standard that allowed that adoption. And, like I said, each day we saw about another ICO raise. And some did go off and launch to be successful. It's supposed to be IOTA, Stratus, and Next were some of the ones that were born out of this ICO days. And then if we remember back, we had one of the projects was formulated out of that was called the DAO. And again, this is interesting because we're seeing a lot of DAO-based projects come online. Even some of the speakers here this week, Tracer DAO, running organizations out of DAO. And I think it's important to remember back that in July 2016, one of the projects, the DAO was hacked, or however we want to consider that. And at that time, we thought of blockchains as immutable, and that project was the impetus to create a fork in Ethereum, which had never really done before. We always had the idea that blockchains were this immutable storage, that it couldn't be rolled back. But within a few days, I believe that the Ethereum community gathered around and created a fork and rolled back the missing funds. And from that day, we still have the Ethereum versus Ethereum Classic chains. But it started to make us think that, is Ethereum too centralized? Have we been thinking about blockchains wrong? Things can happen that can roll back. So then I say, like, just when it couldn't get any worse, I'm sorry to the Bitcoin Gash guys, we then had rupture in the Bitcoin fork as well. Again, we started to think of the inconceivable and started to create Bitcoin forks. Now, this was not taken lightly, and I think the community tried very hard not to split up Bitcoin and to only have one true chain. But as the nature of open source and community and decentralization, we have a way to vote with our feet or with our chains. And Bitcoin was forked, and then subsequently a lot of forks based off the top of that, including a failed fork attempt called Bitcoin SegWit 2.x. So a few years later, we got to a point where we started coming out of what we call, into Bitcoin, into crypto winter, and layer 2 solutions started coming out. And as if it wasn't confusing enough, like I said, we started rolling out layer 2 solutions, and now we're even looking at layer 3. And there's a protocol coming out now, layer 0, zero knowledge proofs, and even things like Ethereum clones such as Binance Smart Chain. So back to the original premise of the talk is, when we're trying to consider where to put our investment or our resources, it's not an easy decision to make. But I guess things have recently thawed out. The DeFi space, in my opinion, has absolutely exploded in the last couple of years. Trailblazers like Uniswap and SushiSwap and the likes have really made headways into disrupting finance. And I think one of the reasons why they're being so successful is because they all exist on the one chain. They're all an Ethereum-based chain at the start. Now they're pivoting into layer 2, but at the start, they're all based on Ethereum. So it allowed developers and contracts to consume contracts and make some really interesting projects, and borrowing off one and investing in the other, all in atomic transactions. And now we're starting to see NFTs become a lot more mainstream. I think every day we're hearing about another household brand coming online and being offering an NFT as the product, and of course the metaverses. So I guess just that kind of bring us a little bit up to speed, and I'll spend the next 10 minutes talking about what I believe the future might hold and some of my predictions on how this may play out. So we've literally seen thousands of altcoins come onto the market, and some have been successful and not so much. We've seen Ethereum split into multiple chains, the Ethereum Classic. We've seen like probably tens of thousands of ERC20 tokens launched, ranging a whole number of domains and industries, and some have been very successful and some not so much. The USDTs and the USDC stable coins, are really becoming known and accepted in the community and in industries. We've seen forks upon forks of Bitcoin and multiple layer 2 Arbitrum and Polygon, etc. So again, from a development or implementation point of view, it's really hard to back a successful chain. And now even this, like I said, we've got layer 0 that might underpin all these or tie them all together. And even talks of now, well, not talks of working towards an Ethereum 2 protocol to help solve some of the scaling issues. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. So I think things are getting better. You can see smart contracting languages continue to evolve. I think Solidity 8.12 is out now. It's a very different beast to when we first got into it. It's becoming more mature. The tooling and development and resources and talent and training and education around all this continues to grow. Scaling solutions are being tested and implemented. and crypto continues to go mainstream. I think, one of the speakers on this blockchain week, Commonwealth Bank, have announced that they're getting buying crypto from Winwood Wallet. So reflecting back on my time when I had to buy Dogecoin off eBay, like it's becoming very prevalent, and it's not seem to be going away. And more, like I said, household brands are coming on. Every day we see another NFT being part of our offering. So I think generally we just find a way. So there's this melting pot of all technologies, and we're still fumbling our way through it, but I think it's an emergent strategy, and generally we are solving these problems as developers and businesses. So the question, I guess some people are here today, what we want to talk about is where do we invest our resources? So some of my reflections on this is, where are some of the high profile projects playing? Like, perhaps if you're in the gaming industry or the racing industry, it might be advantageous to go on the same chain, such as the Zedron people, so you can partner up or pair with them. Align with chains in your domain as mentioned. So if in the gaming, you might want to look at the Immutable X and those things, because you get the cross project benefits if we're all on the same chain. Another consideration might be is the talent. It's hard to find developers and good developers. There's an explosion of languages, Go and Rust as well, and it's very hard to be specialized in one. So these are all the considerations to be taken into when in choosing the project and the technology. The community support too should not be underestimated. We have some really good talent in Australia. Shout out to Bocky and those guys down in Sydney that have really done the groundwork and help develop and educate people in the community off their own, out of their own pocket. They've really been setting the standards and keeping Australia in the forefront of development. And, like I said, those communities and resources should not be underestimated and should be thanked as well. And also, obviously, businesses need to take in consideration such as operation costs and OPEX and CAPEX costs as well when running your chain. So although that's not a distinct answer, some of this should be some of the questions you're asking yourselves when rolling out a strategy or a blockchain-based project. So I guess I got now a couple more minutes, and some of I've got 8 here predictions that might happen. So I guess first is it just becomes all too hard, that there's just too many chains. There's too much. The wallets aren't sustainable, and just literally nothing works. The protocols diverge. Everyone tries to create the newest, greatest thing. Users are confused, and protocols split, and protocols die because there's no adoption. And I think this is a high probability unless we kind of start to collate and work together a little bit more. So it just becomes centralized. We're seeing, players like Binance Smart Chain. Binance obviously have a large budget to maintain and sustain their networks. So maybe we go back to more of a AWS-based scenario. And this is what I mentioned back at the start. There's probably only a few dominant players with respect to cloud hosting, etc. So maybe, those that can maintain and sustain these chains become the dominant players in the industry, and they roll out good infrastructure as we would expect. Another, I think, perhaps possibility, and we're seeing this a little bit today, even I saw an article about Coinbase perhaps being sued about 69 coins that weren't listed or regulated or something like that. So perhaps too much regulation comes on, and I know Blockchain Australia have made some really good progress with the government, Senator Braggs, etc., to try and work with industries and partners and innovators to try and find a balancing point between innovation and compliance and regulation. And it's good to see those conversations are being had, but I pray that we're not going to categorize this industry into something that it shouldn't be, and we should try and find new ways to categorize and regulate and let the innovators innovate. And I'd hate to see the development go offshore because of some of those decisions. Another possibility is that we just have these chains with one idea. So I've seen a lot of products launch on a single chain. There's some chains that just seem to be with respect to one kind of domain. And I don't think that really is the right approach. If we just have, say, I saw that Breitling have introduced provenance on their own chain or something similar. So if it's only Breitling on a chain for provenance, I argue that it doesn't really have much value in there. In that circumstance, they might just have a better technology and just stick it on a SQL server. And if we do that, I don't think the consumer or the mainstream users are really going to understand the premise of why we're going on chain. If it's only one company and they're only in chain, well, except they may as well just stick it on a SQL server. We might have a few dominant chains. I think this is probably more likely. We might have there's just enough. If we go back to other technologies like browsers, we have generally a few players. Arguably, Firefox has dropped off the adoption rate now, but generally we had Firefox and Chrome and a set of few supporting companies that can maintain these. And I think with a bit of cross-chain, I think that's probably a good position, that we have enough resources to sustain a few chains and still have some of the benefits of blockchain. And as scaling solutions come into effect, that fees generally become more stable and tolerable, and we don't need to start chain hopping when prices spike. Another thing is probably likely, as the ecosystem matures, that it does become a little bit ubiquitous. Like, I think maybe in 10 or 20 years that we might look back at some of these conferences and say, like, what were we thinking, and oh, this was new and cool. But in the end of the day, it's just like TCP/IP, that it'd be funny to go to a TCP/IP conference and discuss the merits of V4 and V6 when generally no one really cares, because it just kind of works until it doesn't. And then standards and protocols just become de facto, and we don't really think about the underlying technology or protocols anymore. Like I said, it's just really ubiquitous, and we have enough infrastructure and abstraction to make it work. 7, I think this is, again, it's up there in my punts, that it just becomes mandated. We saw early on that the Dubai government were talking about all government services run upon chains. I'm not really sure how that has realized, but it might just become mandated that payments just pivot to blockchain-based solutions, because it just works. What ramifications that'll have, I'm not too sure. Whether it's good for society or not, I can't really comment. But I think it might just become a backbone of society, and it just might become, again, ubiquitous and mandated, and just become the norm of the way technology runs. And that's probably it for me. So I think that's right on time. So thanks everyone for that, and I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your talks. And thanks to Blockchain Australia and Blockchain Week for putting on fantastic events.